Welcome to the Reclaiming Literature podcast, where we will seek to discover truth hidden in the pages of timeless works of literature and reclaim it for the kingdom of God and the glory of Christ. In this episode, we will be analyzing Chapter 5 of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So let's get to it. Chapter 5 is centered on the invitation that Gatsby wanted Nick to ask of Daisy from the previous chapter. Nick calls his cousin and asks her to visit his house for tea, so that Gatsby could also come over. Of course, this last portion was left out of Nick's invitation. She obliges, and the main events of the chapter unfold. Before we take a look at the events surrounding Gatsby's visit while Daisy is at Nick's house, we need to look at the context. The chapter opens with Gatsby's house lit up, quote, like the World's Fair, from, quote, tower to cellar. To such an extent, quote, the whole corner of the peninsula was blazing with light, which fell unreal on the shrubbery and made thin, elongating glints upon the roadside wires. Page 81. However, unlike what we've seen before, and despite Nick himself suspecting upon seeing the spectacle, Gatsby wasn't throwing one of his elaborate parties. When Nick arrives home after his date with Jordan and sees Gatsby's house aglow, he also notices Gatsby's approaching the arrival of Nick's taxi. When Nick mentions the lights, Gatsby claims the lights were beaming because he had, quote, been glancing into some of the rooms, page 81. However, as would be expected, that wasn't the case. We'll be able to deduce the true intentions as the events of the chapter unfold. After providing this deceptive answer about his house, Gatsby offers to take Nick to Coney Island in his own car, but Nick declines because of how late it was. Upon hearing Nick's rejection of this offer, Gatsby offers that the two, quote, take a plunge in the swimming pool, one that he hadn't, quote, made use of all summer, pages 81 to 82. Nick refuses this offer as well, causing Gatsby to look at him, quote, with suppressed eagerness, page 82. Quickly catching on to Gatsby's true intentions for the offer, Nick states, quote, I talked with Miss Baker. I'm going to call up Daisy tomorrow and invite her over to tea, page 82. Quite obviously, this is the reason for Gatsby's visit at the start of Chapter 5. He wanted to hear whether Nick had accepted his request through Jordan to invite Daisy to tea. Now let's take a look at the exchange in its entirety before moving forward. Hearing that Nick had agreed, Gatsby, in the gentlemanly way he always tried to conduct himself, carelessly said, quote, oh, that's all right. I don't want to put you to any trouble. What day would suit you? Nick asks. What day would suit you? Gatsby corrected Nick quickly. Quote, I don't want to put you to any trouble, you see. How about the day after tomorrow? He considered for a moment. Then with reluctance, I want to get the grass cut, Gatsby said. We both looked at the grass. There was a sharp line where my ragged lawn ended and the darker, well-kept expanse of his began. I suspected that he meant my grass. There's another little thing, he said uncertainly, and hesitated. Would you rather put it off for a few days, I asked. Oh, it isn't about that. At least, he fumbled with a series of beginnings. Why, look here, old sport. You don't make much money, do you? Not very much. This seemed to reassure him, and he continued more confidently. I thought you didn't, if you'll pardon my... You see, I carry on a little business on the side, a sort of sideline, you understand. And I thought that if you don't make very much, you're selling bonds, aren't you, old sport? Trying to. Well, this would interest you. It wouldn't take up very much of your time, and you might pick up a nice bit of money. It happens to be a rather confidential sort of thing. I realize now that under different circumstances, that conversation might have been one of the crises of my life. But because the offer was obviously and tactlessly for a service to be rendered, I had no choice except to cut him off there. I've got my hands full, I said. I'm much obliged, but I couldn't take on any work. You wouldn't have to do any business with Wolfsheim. Evidently he thought I was shying away from the connection mentioned at lunch, but I assured him he was wrong. He waited a moment longer, hoping I'd begin a conversation, but I was too absorbed to be responsive, so he went unwillingly home. And all of that is from pages 82 to 83. As we consider Gatsby's reaction and responses in this scene, we realize a rather depressing reality, just how lonely Gatsby actually is. The idea of someone simply doing something for him for nothing in return is foreign to him. This is another instance, like the introduction to Daisy from Chapter 1, that I think Baz Luhrmann's movie captures very well, which, as I did in our discussion of Chapter 1, I encourage you to look up. In the movie, after Nick rejects Gatsby's offer for payment, so to speak, for his willingness to call Daisy, Nick says, quote, it's a favor, Jay, just a favor. Happy to do it. To which Gatsby says, a favor? Leonardo DiCaprio, who plays Gatsby, acts this particular scene very well, capturing just how foreign a favor that a friend would do for another is to Gatsby. This exchange, yet again, captures how Gatsby doesn't want trouble with anyone regarding his personal affairs. We know he is willing to conduct business with others, but we see just how transactional his life is. However, this sheds light on why he has this attitude with all those around him. Again, the concept of a favor doesn't make any sense to him. Maybe this is because he himself has only been surrounded by those who demand payment for the smallest of gestures. Gatsby is insistent to find the best day that would work for Nick for Daisy to visit, immediately correcting Nick when the latter asks what day Gatsby wanted the event to take place. Gatsby figured that Nick demanded some kind of payment for his willingness to extend the invitation to Daisy, and so he offers a trip to Coney Island, or a swim in his pool, or even welcoming Nick into his shady business dealings. Now, while this is sad insight into Gatsby's life and loneliness, I'm not suggesting that he is totally without blame for being in this situation. Toward the end of our discussion of Chapter 5, we'll see one of the main contributing factors for why he is in this predicament. For the time being, let's turn our attention to the events surrounding the invitation itself, namely Daisy's visit to Nick's house for tea. The day of the affair was one of pouring rain, but that didn't stop Gatsby from fulfilling his desire to have Nick's grass cut. Despite the inclement weather, a hired man arrived at Nick's doorstep that morning, saying that Gatsby had sent him over to tend to Nick's lawn. Also, in preparation for Daisy's visit, Nick drove into West Egg to get some pastries and flowers, the latter of which was a pointless endeavor, for at, quote, 2 o'clock that afternoon, a greenhouse arrived from Gatsby's, with innumerable receptacles to contain it, page 84. Quite naturally, as the preparations were underway for Daisy's arrival, Gatsby was particularly nervous, inspecting Nick's house and even threatening to leave, when Daisy hadn't yet arrived within 2 minutes before the agreed-upon time of 4 o'clock, page 85. Nick was able to calm Gatsby a bit, and Daisy did arrive to Nick's for tea. When her car pulled up to Nick's house, Gatsby left abruptly, shocking Nick when he and Daisy, who was still unaware of the true intent of the invitation, entered Nick's home. However, Gatsby's departure was short-lived, and once Nick and Daisy were inside, a knock came from the front door. With Daisy sitting in the living room, Nick opened the door, and Gatsby, quote, stalked by him into the hall, turned sharply as if he were on a wire, and disappeared into the living room, page 86. The two reunited past lovers sat in silence at their being reintroduced to one another, but Daisy soon broke the silence, saying, quote, I certainly am awfully glad to see you again, page 86. We need now to take a brief look at what transpires when Nick joins the pair in the living room. Nick narrates, quote, Gatsby, his hands still in his pockets, was reclining against the mantelpiece in a strained counterfeit of perfect ease, even of boredom. His head leaned back so far that it rested against the face of a defunct mantelpiece clock, and from this position his distraught eyes stared down at Daisy, who was sitting frightened but graceful on the edge of a stiff chair. We've met before, muttered Gatsby. His eyes glanced momentarily at me, and his lips parted with an abortive attempt at a laugh. Luckily, the clock took this moment to tilt dangerously at the pressure of his head, whereupon he turned and caught it with trembling fingers and set it back in place. Then he sat down, rigidly, his elbow on the arm of the sofa and his chin in his hand. I'm sorry about the clock, he said. My own face had now assumed a deep tropical burn. I couldn't muster up a single commonplace out of 1,000 in my head. It's an old clock, I said, idiotically. I think we all believe for a moment that it has smashed in pieces on the floor. We haven't met for many years, said Daisy, her voice as matter-of-fact as it ever could be. 5 years next November. The automatic quality of Gatsby's answer set us all back at least another minute, pages 86 through 87. We will revisit this interaction in a bit as we look at the remainder of the chapter, but for now, simply take a moment to consider what could be the importance of Gatsby's almost breaking Nick's clock. After this occurrence, in an attempt to allow Gatsby and Daisy to be alone, Nick says that he needs to leave and he heads into the kitchen, followed quickly by Gatsby, who demands to know where Nick is going. Gatsby frantically and nervously confides in Nick that this whole endeavor has been a mistake, to which Nick instructs Gatsby that Daisy, too, is nervous and that Gatsby needs to stop being rude and return to the living room, pages 87 to 88. Upon hearing this news, Gatsby does, indeed, return to the living room, and Nick walks outside alone. While outside and staring at the only thing that could capture his attention, namely Gatsby's house, Nick contemplates its construction and shares that a man had built it as a means to found a family, page 88, and that he had, quote, agreed to pay 5 years' taxes on all the neighboring cottages if the owners would have their roofs thatched with straw, page 88. But this dream was abandoned with the neighbor's refusal, and the man's children, after he passed away, sold the house with, quote, the black wreath still on the door, page 88. While Nick thinks on the origin of Gatsby's house, he concludes his ruminations by saying, quote, Americans, while occasionally willing to be serfs, have always been obstinate about being peasantry, also on page 88. What could this mean? Perhaps it is further insight into the inequality between classes that Fitzgerald is concerned with in this novel. Perhaps he is suggesting that the whims of social elites shouldn't dictate how those, quote, less than, live their lives. Nick then rejoins Daisy and Gatsby, the latter of whom, quote, literally glowed and radiated with a new well-being, without a word or gesture of exultation, page 89, as he looked at Daisy. Nick informs them the rain has stopped, to which Gatsby instinctively says, quote, has it? Without even noticing that, quote, there were twinkle bells of sunshine in the room, page 89. Gatsby then tells Daisy that he wants to show her his house, and Daisy proceeds to exit the room to wash her face after it had become, quote, smeared with tears, also on page 89. With Daisy gone, Nick and Gatsby wait for her outside, and while waiting, Gatsby says, quote, my house looks well, doesn't it? See how the whole front of it catches the light, page 89. And when Daisy returns, Gatsby points to his house, to which Daisy cries, quote, that huge thing there? I don't see how you live there all alone, page 90. Gatsby answers, quote, I keep it always full of interesting people, night and day, people who do interesting things, celebrated people, also on page 90. If you'll bear with me a bit longer as I establish more context for the analysis proper, I want to read the following events and then offer some thoughts on what happens. Nick narrates the following as they toured Gatsby's mansion. Quote, instead of taking the shortcut along the Sound, we went down the road and entered by the big postern. With enchanting murmurs, Daisy admired this aspect or that, with the feudal silhouette against the sky, admired the gardens, the sparkling odor of jonquils, and the frothy odor of hawthorn and plum blossoms, and the pale gold odor of kiss me at the gate. It was strange to reach the marble steps and find no stir of bright dresses in and out at the door, and hear no sound but bird voices in the trees. And inside we wandered through Marie Antoinette music rooms and restoration salons. I felt there were guests concealed behind every couch and table, under orders to be breathlessly silent until we had passed through. As Gatsby closed the door of the Meryton College library, I could have sworn I heard the owl-eyed man break into ghostly laughter. We went upstairs, through period bedrooms, swathed in rose and lavender silk and vivid new flowers, through dressing rooms and pool rooms, and bathrooms with sunken baths, intruding into one chamber where a disheveled man in pajamas was doing liver exercises on the floor. It was Klipspringer, the boarder. I had seen him wandering hungrily about the beach that morning. Finally, we came to Gatsby's own apartment, a bedroom and a bath, and an Adam study, where we sat down and drank a glass of chartreuse he took from a cupboard in the wall. He hadn't once ceased looking at Daisy, and I think he revalued everything in his house according to the measure of response it drew from her well-loved eyes. Sometimes, too, he stared around at his possessions in a dazed way, as though in her actual and astounding presence none of it was any longer real. Once he nearly toppled down a flight of stairs. His bedroom was the simplest room of all, except where the dresser was garnished with a toilet set of pure dull gold. Daisy took the brush with delight and smothered her hair, whereupon Gatsby sat down and shaded his eyes and began to laugh. It's the funniest thing, old sport, he said hilariously. When I tried to... He had passed visibly through 2 states and was entering upon a third. After his embarrassment and his unreasoning joy, he was consumed with wonder at her presence. He had been full of the idea so long, dreamed it through to the end, waited with his teeth set, so to speak, at an inconceivable pitch of intensity. Now, in the reaction, he was running down like an overwhelmed clock. Pages 90 through 92. Gatsby's nervousness in this whole scene can be summed up by Nick's statement. Quote, Gatsby hadn't once ceased looking at Daisy, and I think he revalued everything in his house according to the measure of response it drew from her well-loved eyes. Sometimes, too, he stared around at his possessions in a dazed way, as though, in her actual and astounding presence, none of it was any longer real. Page 91. Gatsby had worked for years in potentially shady dealings to build his house, paying unknown costs monetarily and morally, and unknown to her, all of it depended on Daisy's reaction to what she saw. He has literally placed all of his eggs into one basket. Nick, too, realizes the burden that's placed on Daisy. When he's about to leave them for the day, at the end of the chapter, Nick states, quote, "As I went over to say goodbye, I saw that the expression of bewilderment had come back into Gatsby's face, as though a faint doubt had occurred to him as to the quality of his present happiness." Almost 5 years. There must have been moments, even that afternoon, when Daisy tumbled short of his dreams, not through her own fault, but because of the colossal vitality of his illusion. It had gone beyond her, beyond everything. He had thrown himself into it with a creative passion, adding to it all the time, decking it out with every bright feather that drifted his way. Pages 95 to 96. The danger of such endeavors will be one of the focuses of the reclaiming portion of this episode, so we'll return here in a moment. Before we do so, however, there are 3 aspects of this chapter that I want to draw your attention to. 1. An interaction between Daisy and Gatsby in his bedroom. 2. The introduction of a man named Dan Cody. And 3. The many times Nick, or Fitzgerald, brings up Daisy's voice. We'll look at these 3 one at a time. First, when Nick, Daisy, and Gatsby arrive at Gatsby's bedroom, Nick narrates the following. Quote, "Recovering himself in a minute, he opened for us 2 hulking patent cabinets, which held his mask suits and dressing gowns and ties, and his shirts, piled like bricks in stacks a dozen high. I've got a man in England who buys me clothes. He sends me over a selection of things at the beginning of each season, spring and fall." He took a pile of shirts and began throwing them, one by one, before us, shirts of sheer linen and thick silk and fine flannel, which lost their folds as they fell and covered the table in a many-colored disarray. While we admired, he brought more, and the soft, rich heap mounted higher. Shirts with stripes and scrolls, and plaids and coral and apple green and lavender and faint orange, with monograms of Indian blue. Suddenly, with a strange sound, Daisy bent her head into the shirts and began to cry stormily. "They're such beautiful shirts," she sobbed, her voice muffled in the thick folds. "It makes me sad because I've never seen such beautiful shirts before." Page 92. This last quote is another one of those that finds itself among my favorite in the novel, because of its irony and weight. Daisy had all the money in the world, and could have clothes made for her and sent to her from England, just like Gatsby did. So why would she cry at the sight of, quote, "such beautiful shirts," and become sad, quote, because she had never seen such beautiful shirts before? There must be something more going on here, and there is. We can't understand the full extent of the subtext implied through this scene, partly because neither Nick nor Fitzgerald elaborates on Daisy's crying, but also because we still don't have a full sense of who Gatsby is. So once again, this will be something we have to revisit later. However, 2 suggestions are possible. 1, Daisy is so shallow that beautiful shirts from England could evoke such a response. Now, this could be reminiscent to her statement about wanting her daughter, and any woman, to be a beautiful little fool from chapter 1. It could also be her realizing some of what she missed out on by marrying Tom and not waiting for Gatsby. Think back to the letter she received that caused her to weep in chapter 4. Again, we can't establish anything clear for the time being, but this quote is worth a brief attention, so I wanted to mention it now. Moving on to the second aspect of the chapter that I wanted to mention before moving on to the reclaiming portion of the episode, namely the introduction of a man named Dan Cody. While Nick, Daisy, and Gatsby are touring the latter's house, Nick spots a photograph of a, quote, "elderly man in yachting costume," with a smaller picture on a bureau of Gatsby himself in yachting costume. Page 93. Gatsby informs Nick that the elderly man is Dan Cody, a man who has since passed away and who was Gatsby's best friend years ago. We don't get any other information on the man for now, but we will learn more about him in a later chapter, so I wanted to be sure to draw your attention to him. Now, the final aspect of the chapter that I wanted to visit before moving to the reclaiming portion of the episode is the frequent mentioning of Daisy's voice in chapter 5. It is brought up 5 specific and individual times, found on pages 85, 86, 87, 92, and 96. Now, I know some who endeavor to analyze literature will make conclusions based on random events in novels that, in truth, don't have much significance, other than to set a scene, etc. However, when a particular thing is brought up time and time again within a short span of a few pages, it's worth considering. And Daisy's voice is one of the latter. If you'll remember from chapter 1, Daisy's voice is one of the first things Nick draws our attention to, saying, quote, "It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down, as if each speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again." Page 9. And given the well-established context of chapter 5 and the events surrounding Nick and Fitzgerald's mentioning of it, it will benefit us to consider it for a moment. So what could the incessant description of Daisy's voice mean? I think Nick, at the end of chapter 5, explains it well when he states, quote, "As I watched Gatsby, he adjusted himself a little, visibly. His hand took hold of hers, and as she said something low in his ear, he turned toward her with a rush of emotion. I think that voice held him most, with its fluctuating, feverish warmth, because it couldn't be overdreamed. That voice was a deathless song," page 96. About Daisy's voice, one commentator made a comparison to a siren's call of Greek mythology, that which would draw men mad as they heard the song and longed for it. This comparison is apt, again, given the context of chapter 5. As we've established, Gatsby has put all of his eggs into the singular basket of the dream of impressing and winning back Daisy, and as she fawned over his house, he experienced a bit of confusion that what he had dreamed up didn't live up to his expectations. However, her siren call of a voice was immaterial and could hold up under the weight of fire and freshness that Gatsby has stored up in his ghostly heart, page 96. Now, with the events of chapter 5 described, let's turn our attention to what needs to be reclaimed, so to speak. There are two topics that I want to focus on in this section, namely hospitality, or so-called hospitality, and the inability of things of this world to truly and lastingly satisfy. If you read chapter 5 or listened to my reading of it, which you can find on the channel in an episode released at the same time as this one, or if you're just checking out this episode, you'll recall Gatsby's so-called hospitality toward Nick and his offering to take him on a visit to Coney Island, or to allow him to swim in his swimming pool, not to mention the so-called hospitality that he extends often by throwing the extravagant parties and fronting all of the costs for them. However, from the insight we gain from chapter 5, we know Gatsby's true motives for extending such hospitality. He is using it as a means to get to Daisy. Now, as we've discussed earlier, we know at least that his hospitality toward Nick is because the idea of a favor between friends is foreign to him. And again, this is quite sad. However, that doesn't diminish the fact that it's tainted by a level of manipulation. Is hospitality still true hospitality when the underlying motive fueling the generosity toward others is self-centered? I suppose one could argue yes, because people are still the recipients of whatever is provided to them. However, should this be so? I think most people, and all Christians, would answer no. And another question arises. Is it true hospitality when what is offered by the benefactor is potentially or outright harmful, even if its harm isn't seen until later? I think the answer is quite clearly no to this as well, which begs for a discussion of what is true and right and good. This, of course, calls us back to our discussion of the right parameters around empathy that we as Christians should put into place, which we visited in our discussion of chapter 4. That which is true and right and good is what draws people upward, namely to God Himself. This is what Jordan B. Peterson argues in the book I mentioned in the last episode, We Who Wrestle with God. Also, I misspoke about one thing last time that I wanted to clarify. In the last episode, I said that Peterson wouldn't likely call those things which do not point toward God as sinful. However, after further reflection, after posting episode 4, I realized that he would, and he does refer to the Greek definition of sin, which is missing the mark. That which we do that does not point people to God is sinful, as it doesn't point people to the mark, the ideal of truth, righteousness, and goodness. Now, going back to our discussion of true hospitality, that which is truly hospitable is that which points people to God as well, as God Himself is the source of all truth, wisdom, and goodness. See John 14:6, 1 Corinthians 1:24, Colossians 2:3, and James 1:17. We are to work heartily as unto the Lord, Colossians 3:23, and that last phrase is key, namely unto the Lord. As St. James says in the verse I just mentioned from his epistle, James 1:17, every good gift comes from God, and we, in our finite limitability, are in no place, by our own wisdom and insight, as if we have any that has not been given to us, to determine that which is best for our lives and to manipulate situations to arrive at an outcome. No, this is by no means an argument that we are to twiddle our thumbs and sit back, waiting for God to transport us somewhere that He wants us to be. We are called to work, being His ambassadors and ministers of reconciliation, 2 Corinthians 5:16-21, which we discussed in episode 4. And also work, that is, the furthering of God's kingdom, was in place in the Garden of Eden before the fall of man, as Adam and Eve were mandated to cultivate the garden, have dominion over it, and subdue it. See Genesis 1:26-28 and Genesis 2:5. So I reject the idea that because God is sovereign over all things and is the source of all that is good and right and wise, we are to slothfully sit by, waiting for Him to place us where He wants us to be. However, in our advancing of his kingdom, which includes the daily work we do at our jobs, the love we show our friends and family, the leisure activities we participate in, and the hospitality we show others, we are not to be like Gatsby, taking supposed control of our destinies and manipulating those around us to arrive at what we have determined to be what's best for our lives. This brings to mind the significance of Gatsby's fumbling with the clock in Nick's house. For years, he has been trying to take control of time and revisit that time he had met Daisy at her home when he visited her from Camp Taylor during the war. It also brings to mind Nick's comment about Americans. If you'll remember, as he was standing outside his home as Gatsby and Daisy talked, Nick stated, quote, "Americans, while occasionally willing to be serfs, have always been obstinate about being peasantry," page 88. Now, no, I'm not calling for everyone to live in poverty as if that's the only way to rightly serve the Lord, but this idea that any means necessary to achieve one's goals, including manipulative hospitality, is foreign to truth revealed to us by God in Scripture. It's eerily similar to the Lord's rebuke in Isaiah 29:13 and Matthew 15:7-9, wherein Christ says, quote, "You hypocrites, rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men." Showing quote-unquote hospitality to others with motivation to some self-centered goal is contrary to what true hospitality and true worship is, for we as Christians are called to worship God through being hospitable. See Hebrews 13:2, Romans 12:13, and 1 Peter 4:8-10. And true hospitality is worship, as St. Peter makes very clear in the passage I just referenced. 1 Peter 4:8-10 reads, quote, "Above all, keep fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without complaint. And as each one has received a special gift, employ it in serving one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God." True hospitality is expressed through true love for other people, that is, showing God's love to others with the intention that by doing so we have a clear avenue to point them to God Himself, who is, to reiterate, the source of all love, for God alone can satisfy the longing within each of us. Now this brings us to the next point that I wanted to focus on in this reclaiming portion, and what we will end this episode discussing, namely that true satisfaction is only found within God Himself. The narration that Nick provides in chapter 5 does a great job of showing this, even if it's not what Fitzgerald specifically had in mind. If you'll recall, when Gatsby was showing Daisy around his house, he was met with a sense of disappointment. And Nick elaborates when he says, quote, "As I went over to say goodbye, I saw that the expression of bewilderment had come back into Gatsby's face, as though a faint doubt had occurred to him as to the quality of his present happiness. Almost 5 years. There must have been moments, even that afternoon, when Daisy tumbled short of his dreams. Not through her own fault, but because of the colossal vitality of his illusion. It had gone beyond her, beyond everything. He had thrown himself into it with a creative passion, adding to it all the time, decking it out with every bright feather that drifted his way." Page 95-96. Now, of course, most people will not go to the extent that Gatsby did to achieve what he longed for and hoped would satisfy him. But we do this with many things. We look to family, friends, jobs, cars, entertainment, drugs, and really anything of this physical world to give us what only God Himself can provide within Himself. This reality brings two quotes to mind, one of which we've already considered on this channel. One of those is by St. Augustine, and the other is by C.S. Lewis. St. Augustine says, quote, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find rest in you." And Lewis argues, quote, "If we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world." If we do as Gatsby did, placing all of our eggs in one basket, or even seeking true and lasting satisfaction in the things of this world, we will always be met with the same confusion he was met with when we achieve the things we're aiming toward, namely, why didn't that satisfy me like I expected it to? The answer lies in the truth that the things of this world were meant to point us to God Himself. Family, including spouses, parents, and siblings, friends, entertainment, cars, etc., are good gifts given to us by God, but they are not the ends in themselves. We are meant to enjoy them and use them as avenues to usher ourselves and those around us upward to their source. So let us always remember that God Himself is the source of all that is good, and let us enjoy what He has given to us and extend those gifts to others, showing them true hospitality through the gifts, so that we will all be ushered into the presence of the one in whose presence is fullness of joy and in whose presence there are pleasures forevermore. God bless.